First of all, I welcome you all to UC Irvine's Public Policy Prep program, which we also call as P3 programs, Public Lecture on Science Policy. So our P3 program is sponsored by Burroughs Wellcome. Like 2016, we got money, and with that generous support only, we were able to launch this program, and which has become very, very popular amongst PhD students and postdocs, not only at UC Irvine, but outside of UC Irvine also. Right now, the program is funded partially by the microgrant from National Science Policy Network. So we would like to thank National Science Policy Network for their generous funding. So the program really aims to make PhD students and postdocs aware about policy careers. And so in the last 1 year, a lot has happened. We've seen change in administration. We have COVID-19 pandemic and a lot of things going on. There's a lot of fear and uncertainty, and that has really led to changing landscape of science policy. And therefore, we thought that this would be wonderful to bring someone who's an expert in science for policy and policy for science to talk about, sort of introduce the idea and concept of science policy. So it's my pleasure to introduce moderator for today's discussion, Adriana Bankson. Dr. Bankson is currently serving as the CEO and the managing publisher of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. Additionally, she's also the principal legislative analyst in the University of California Office of Federal Government Relations, where she serves as an advocate for UC with Congress, administration, and federal agencies. Prior to this position, Adriana was a policy and advocacy fellow at Society for Neuroscience, where she provided staff support for special and ongoing projects, including SFN's annual lobby event and annual meeting. In addition to working at UC, in fact, Adriana and I also have worked at Future of Research, where she serves as a policy task force co-leader at the board of directors of Future of Research. She obtained her PhD in biochemistry, cell and developmental biology from Emory University, and bachelor's in biological sciences from Clemson University. So welcome to our speaker, and thank you very much, Adriana. So take it away.
Thank you, Harinder. It's great to be here with all of you. Thank you for joining us today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Toby Smith. Toby is the Vice President for Policy and Global Affairs at the Association for American Universities, where he provides strategic leadership and management to the association's priorities and oversees matters relating to science and innovation policy, broader impacts of science, and AAU's international activities. Prior to joining AAU, Toby worked as a federal relations representative in DC offices of the University of Michigan and MIT. He began his Washington career on the Hill as a legislative assistant to Congressman Bob Traxler. And he has written and spoken widely on science policy and funding issues. He's also the co-author of Beyond Sputnik, which was published by University of Michigan Press. And he currently serves on the advisory board of the National Alliance for Broader Impact. He's also the co-chair of ESAP and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And he's also a member of the JSPG Governing Board. Toby, thank you so much for being here today. I'll turn it over to you.
And Harinder, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And you'll learn I'm passionate about encouraging scientists and engineers to engage in policy. I know that the title and what I talk about a lot is not only science policy and what it is and what science for policy is and policy and then policy for science. But I also am going to talk a little bit today about how to effectively advocate for science, given the political polarization we see in not only in Washington, I'll talk about how that polarization exists throughout the country these days, and it's at higher levels than ever in our history, especially in Congress, but also the challenges that we face in light of the recent pandemic and some of the things we're seeing as it relates to public views on science. And also the challenge that we have where these days it seems that if you read it on the internet, many people believe it's true. So let's get right into this. And I'm going to try and zoom through some different topics and then open it up for and very interested, engaging questions. So as a starting point, let me just see if I can get my slides to advance. That's the starting point. There we go. Okay. Now it's working. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. You've already heard that I'm Vice President for Science Policy and Global Affairs at AAU. AAU represents 66 leading research universities, including UC Irvine. And we represent the presidents of those institutions, and they're public. We're kind of split almost equal between public and private institutions. Two of those are Canadian institutions, by the way. When you ask what I do, you heard my resume that I started on Capitol Hill. My degrees, by the way, because this will come into play later, I got a Bachelor of General Studies from the University of Michigan, it's my undergrad, and then I got a master's in legislative affairs while I was working on the Hill. So not necessarily a strong science background, but we'll talk about why that's relevant as I go through my talk. What have I done career-wise? Well, I focused on innovation, competitive science policy. You could call me an advocate. I have been involved in, certainly I've been a registered lobbyist. I'm not right now. In Washington, D.C., you're really nobody until you create a group. That's how we get things done. We build coalitions. So I've been both a member of many coalitions and been involved in starting new coalitions to accomplish things. I've also spent a lot of time trying to respond to regulations and ensure compliance. One of the areas I spend a lot of time these days, I'm happy to discuss it further, is some of the issues related to concerns about research security and research integrity. So that all said, I'm actually coming to you today from where I grew up in rural Michigan, Carroll, Michigan. And when people ask me what do you really do, Toby, I often don't say I'm a lobbyist or an advocate, not because I don't think it's a reputable thing. I honestly do think lobbying is very important, but I try to give them a real sense of what I do, which is that I say I'm in the cross-cultural communications business, which has really been a career of making the work of scientists and engineers relevant to lay people. And the reason I don't sometimes want to say I'm a lobbyist, people have a lot of misconceptions about that. I really don't. I don't go to fundraisers. I don't write checks. I do lobby for things, but a lot of what I do is educate people about why science is important. And we'll talk about it. And so when we think about, I like to start my talks by talking about the two cultures, the political culture and kind of the world in which politicians live and folks on Capitol Hill, and then the scientists and engineers and how they think of things. So this is the culture that when I worked on the Hill, first of all, a lot of folks are fairly young. The staffers are, I started on the Hill when I was 21 years old, right out of as an undergraduate, as a legislative assistant, working for my hometown congressman from here in Michigan. And like you see there, a lot of the folks, they got political science degrees or history degrees, and many went on to law school, similarly to my background. So that's the political culture. And then there's the academic culture, which I work with all the time. And you see this poor little guy who's just finished painting on the door, the Department of people who have a certain degree of difficulty putting their thoughts into brief, concise, and unrambling language. And that is the challenge. And when I think about what my job is, it's often trying to translate what's important that scientists do to people who don't and didn't have much science in their background. And we'll talk about that more as I go along. So I talk about, to define this cultural divide, I like to talk about a series of words and how scientists think versus how politicians think. And scientists think they're very quantitative while politicians are qualitative. Scientists are specialists focusing on a very specific scientific issue. And politicians need to know a little about everything because they're representing a wide range of interest of the constituents who send and vote for them to go to Congress. Scientists look at facts and evidence. Politicians often base their views on public opinion. Scientists hate to make promises, especially when you ask them to say, do you have any idea what your research might lead to? They say, well, I don't know. Well, I say politicians love to make promises, even if they might not be able to keep them or actual reality. Scientists ask why, and politicians will ask, and I've taken many scientists in to meet with members of Congress, they ask why they should care and why Why does what scientists do matter to the people that they represent, those constituents who live in places like the district that I represented working for Congressman Traxler on the Hill? For scientists, money equals research and more grants, and for politicians, money equals, it's how they get reelected. They're in a constant mode of fundraising. Scientists think long-term. This is one of the challenges and conflicts with the policy world and the political world. Politicians, especially in the House of Representatives, they have to get elected every 2 years. So they're on a, they're thinking about their next election. What can I do to prove that I'm bringing home something for the folks who vote for me? And science, one of its challenges is it often doesn't deliver in the short term. Things happen in a long term. And when we talk about the pandemic, I'll give you an example. So let's talk about science policy now. What is it? Well, as Adriana mentioned, I co-authored a book on science policy, and this is how we define national science policy, which is the set of rules, regulations, methods, practices, guidelines under which scientific research is actually conducted. Now that is different. There's policy for science, which is what I just described, and then there's science that can help policy. What's that? So I just talked about policy for science, which is about, how do we structure policies that help to ensure that science can be effectively conducted. But then there's the fact that science can act in other areas of policy, such as environmental policy, energy policy, national defense, health care. And now there are some areas, and I often talk about climate change as one where you can have both. There's both policies that fund climate change research, and there's what that research then tells policymakers about actions that they might want to take to affect environmental policy or energy policy. And sometimes if they don't like what the research says, they can defund the actual research in climate change. And we see some of that interaction. Now, I also like to point out that there's a big difference between science and science policy. And this is Phil Griffiths, who's a mathematician who was very much involved in science policy, said that, pointed out that science, is value free, it's ideally effective, where science policy in any area of policy is not value free at all. In fact, it's full of value opinions. It's open to public debate, and it's impossible to say that a particular policy is a right or wrong. As I say, it's often what comes out of the sausage making process that we have in Washington. And when you get a bill out of Congress, everybody's happy that it passed, but probably nobody thinks it's the best policy. They all had other things they thought would have been better, but you have to compromise. That's what our democratic process is all about. But that lack of knowing what the right policy is sometimes, and the difference between science and what scientists feel comfortable with and how policy is made and shaped has sometimes led individuals in the scientific community to really shy away from getting too engaged in policy. It's also important that when you think of science and its role in the formation of policy, that science is only one input into policymaking process. And there are other factors when a policymaker has to make a decision. They have to take into consideration other things like economics, ethics, budget trade-offs, public opinion comes into those decisions. And I often tell scientists, remember that science is not policy prescriptive. It does not tell you the right policy that's the best policy, but it can inform policymaking. I also tell scientists and engineers, when you are talking about what policy you favor, you're giving an opinion. You can use science to inform your judgment and your opinion, but it's not that science says there is one right policy answer. And so it's important just to keep in mind that difference as you talk about the role that science should play, and not to politicize science by suggesting that there's a right policy answer based upon what the science says. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. And one of the things that I feel is very important is talking about the history of the system that supports science in the United States and how we ended up where we're at today. And Harry Truman once said that there's nothing new in the world except the history you don't know. I find that with science policy, that's really true. So I like to talk about, I like to take people back to a time prior to World War II, when the federal government didn't really fund much scientific research at the universities that I represent at AAU. If we go back to the early 1900s, there was really the primary area where there's federal funding was agriculture research, and that's because of the creation of the land-grant universities, which had an obligation to take the research for agriculture that was generated, agriculture mechanics, and then distribute, make sure that was disseminated and then utilized in local communities through eventually what became the Cooperative Extension Service. And so there was funding for agriculture research, but otherwise the universities didn't really they were a little bit concerned about accepting too much federal funding, because they felt if they took money from the government would tell them what they could and couldn't conduct research on. So in the early days, it was the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Mellons that funded a lot of research at the research universities. And the problem was money started to dry up after the Depression from those big industrial moguls, and the university started to find problems figuring out where to get the money from, and enter World War II. And a guy named Vannevar Bush. This is Bush. So you see what he looks like. He was a conservative engineer from MIT. He was recruited by or asked by Franklin Roosevelt to lead the efforts, the scientific efforts that led in World War II that led to the atomic bomb, amongst other things, but a lot of other great advances that we saw at the time, whether it be radar or precision-guided bombs, or a lot of health advances during the time too, like blood substitutes were developed. So Bush was in charge of that effort, and he believed that universities had to play a role. And he advocated for a system whereby the government would give contracts to universities and university faculty, and they would do research for the government. And he also believed that in doing so, if you kept those faculty at the universities, they would train the next generation of scientists. That was a very novel idea. And after the war, as I said, science had been so important to the success of the war effort that FDR asked Bush to write a report on how science could help in peacetime, similarly to how it helped the war effort and led to such great successes. And the result of that was that in 1945, in July, Bush submitted that report that he was asked to write by Roosevelt. Interesting enough, while he was writing, FDR passed away. And so it was actually submitted to Harry Truman in July. And what's important about that report is it proposed that there be one national science foundation created to support the work of many of those other areas of national interest: health, economics, national security even. And if you look at the NSF Organic Act, it's interesting because it actually says that part of NSF's mission is national defense. I'll explain why it didn't quite work out the way Bush foresaw it in the end, but he did propose this idea of one national science foundation to support all of the national objectives that the country had and the agencies. And that was what was in Science, the Endless Frontier, which, by the way, we just celebrated the 75th anniversary of this report. It's important to note that I talk about Bush, but I also like to point out Harley Kilgore. Kilgore was a New Deal Democrat from West Virginia. He was elected in 1941. For those who have ever heard of a guy named Rush Holt, who used to be a member of Congress and ran the American Association for the Advancement of Science here not so long ago, Kilgore beat out his father, Rush Holt Sr., for the U.S. Senate seat that he held. And so he's elected in 1941. And Bush and Kilgore both believed there needed to be a post-war science policy, but they had different views on how to get there. And so I like to point these things out because they really define some of the same debates we are having about science policy today. And they were really the arguments that happened around the creation of the National Science Foundation. So first of all, discussion, and Bush believed that funds for science should be funded based upon the merit of the science, where Kilgore believed that those funds should be spread around geographically, perhaps given in block grants, and then to each state, and then the state would fund its own universities. Interesting enough, Bush won that debate. And that's why we have the system of merit review, and NSF funds things based upon the quality of the science as judged by other scientists. But note that other countries didn't go that route. The UK, for example, they funded things more geographically. The other thing is, note that this debate isn't over. Right now, we have legislation in Congress that proposes money for the EPSCoR program, which the EPSCoR program actually, while it's competitive, it gives money to certain states that don't and have not done as well in competing for federal funding from agencies like the National Science Foundation. And so the current legislation that's going through Congress to increase funding, which we're happy to talk about in Q&A, and would authorize significantly increased funding for NSF, actually calls for 20% of that funding to go to those states that are not, for instance, Massachusetts, California, Texas, those states that get the majority of, if you look at the universities they represent, MIT, Harvard, Stanford, and some of the university, UC Berkeley. So that debate is still happening, but Bush won, and that's why NSF, at least so far, has been based upon, and the way they award funds is based upon merit. Who appoints the NSF director? Bush felt just like scientists should judge the quality of, who gets funding for scientific projects, that the National Science Board, a group of scientists, should appoint the National Science Foundation director. Well, he lost that debate. He lost it because Harry Truman, the president, in 1947, when the House and Senate passed the bills that were presented to carry out Bush's proposal in the Endless Frontier passed, he pocket vetoed that bill. Why? He felt the president should appoint the NSF director. And so what we ended up with was a system where the NSF director is appointed by the president, but serves a 6-year term. So that's different than like Francis Collins, who heads the NIH, who serves at the will of the president. And when, despite the fact that Dr. Collins has stayed on through different administrations, each time the president changes, he submits a letter of resignation. That didn't happen with France Cordova when Donald Trump came in, and it didn't happen with the current NSF director when President Biden came in, because he had been appointed during the last administration. Basic versus applied research. Bush believed that the federal government's role was to fund basic research, not to fund applied research or more that kind of technology area. Interesting enough, Kilgore, I said they had, in some ways, they believed there needed to be a post-war science and technology policy. Well, Kilgore in 1942 introduced legislation to create not a National Science Foundation, but a National Technology Foundation. The idea being the government should play more of a role in funding applied research. Bush, however, felt that was the role of industry and didn't support that. Bush won that, and it's one of the reasons why we've had some big debates in recent years of, should we create an organization like ARPA-E that starts to, get into space that some might call picking winners and losers, or in corporate welfare, or setting industrial policy. So Bush won that. That's why NSF really, and other agencies in the U.S. has focused their efforts at least universities much more on basic research than applied research. Who owns intellectual property? This was something that Bush believed that the inventors or the universities who got grants should own the intellectual property. He didn't win that debate. In fact, it wasn't until 1980 that universities who got the grants from the federal government were able to maintain the intellectual property and share it with their faculty inventors. Prior to that, the government owned all the intellectual property that was developed from government funded research, even if it occurred at a university. That was because of the change that took place under the Bayh-Dole Act, where they gave the opportunity to universities to own that intellectual property. Last thing I want to stress is that, many people don't realize Vannevar Bush didn't really support federal funding for social science research. That's why, in fact, NSF didn't have a social economics and behavioral sciences arm until that was added as a directorate in 1991. So note that, and we still have debates about should the NSF fund areas like political science or economics, and that's a debate that is often we've seen play out on Capitol Hill. So what's important about this is it wasn't until 1950, by the way, that the NSF finally was created and the bills were passed and authorized by Congress. That means bills introduced in 1945 took 5 years. During that time, the agencies that, especially the Office of Naval Research, but the military agencies, they weren't waiting for this new foundation to be created to fund military research. They started increasing their appropriations for military research. The Office of Naval Research, followed by the Air Force and the Army. And additionally, the Atomic Energy Commission, the precursor to the Department of Energy, they wanted to understand the health effects of radiation on individuals after the bomb. They also wanted to understand whether fission could be used for civilian energy purposes. So they started funding research. The National Institute of Health, at the time, it was only an institute, merged with the National Cancer Institute to become the National Institutes of Health. And they started to fund research to support health. And well, what's the significance of all this? By the time the NSF was created, those mission agencies were funding their own research to support their missions. And the NSF, the role that Bush saw, which is they would support those other national goals, NSF didn't really have a big role, and their original appropriations was a pittance compared to what the mission-based agencies were funding. So what it really resulted in is an organization whose niche became to fund blue sky research, the very basic research that other agencies might not fund, and left, at least Bush, and if you read his biography, he saw NSF as somewhat of a stepchild. It wasn't what he originally envisioned. It also created a pluralistic system of support for science across multiple agencies, where most nations have only one agency that funds scientific research in their country. The US is unique in that it has multiple agencies. In fact, you can, if you count them all up, there are 12 different departments, federal departments, and 18 independent agencies that can claim that they support science in some way, shape, or form. That also means you have lots of congressional committees that deal with science because they all have jurisdiction. And it makes it very messy. And I think it's important to realize that, because it's sometimes one of the reasons it's hard to understand science policy and how things work. But it is really important to get that. And so we kind of end up with our system of support for science accidentally. It wasn't what Bush intended. The other thing I want to just touch on really quickly, because we talked a little bit about the difference between Bush and Kilgore in terms of the view of basic and applied research. Bush believed in a linear model of research and innovation, that basic research, you fund basic research, it leads to applied research, it leads to development. That notion of a linear model has been largely discredited. It was discredited by a guy named Donald Stokes, who talked about that there's actually places in the middle, use-inspired research, like the work done by Louis Pasteur, where you can think about the knowledge you need to help you solve problems that are much more applied. And that's called use-inspired research. It's also this notion, and we touch upon it in our book, that innovation is much more dynamic. and that oftentimes you can learn from what you don't know on the development side, what knowledge you need to know on the basic side. And so you have a much more dynamic system of innovation, and the linear model doesn't really work. It's one of the reasons why maybe the notion that you can only fund, the government should only fund basic research was perhaps a misnomer, the wrong direction. And maybe there were some things that Kilgore was saying that to fund this kind of valley of death where we lose a lot of good ideas because they can't be commercialized, maybe there does need to be some funding to support those areas. So that's enough for history. Let me move on, because I now want to talk for the remaining about 10 minutes on why understanding, engaging in science policy matters and how to do it effectively. So you see this professor, he's talking, a physics professor, talking about antimatter, dark matter, and the existence of doesn't matter. And one of the things that when I started working in the Hill, I think that was the attitude of many scientists, is I don't need to get involved, just send us the money, we'll do good things with it, trust us. What I point out today is given the budget constraints and the questions about science and its value, scientists can't afford to take that attitude, the attitude that has sometimes led some to call them welfare queens in white coats because they feel they're entitled to funding for science. It's really important to justify and explain it to people why it matters. And not why it matters just to scientists, but why does it matter to them? So the other challenge we have is many members of Congress, policymakers they came from backgrounds like me. They don't really understand the scientific process, how it works. Just as an example, let's talk about and look at the current members of Congress and their background. So less than 5% of the current members of Congress have really any scientific or engineering backgrounds. I point out there's 1.5 physicists. I'll explain that in a second. One mathematician, one chemist, one animal scientist in the House. There's Senator Hickenlooper from Colorado. He got a master's in geology. He started as a geologist. The 1.5 physicists is because at one point we had 3 PhDs in Congress who actually had PhDs, gotten their degrees in physics. That was Rush Holt, who I already mentioned. It was Vern Ehlers from Michigan, and it was Bill Foster from Illinois. Rush Holt and Vern Ehlers retired from Congress. Bill Foster was still there, was asked by the Wall Street Journal, what's it like to be the only physicist in Congress and to support the physics caucus on your own? He pointed out that Seth Moulton, who had just been elected in Massachusetts at the time as a representative, got his BS in physics. So I count him as a half of a physicist. There are 10 engineers, 8 in the House, 2 in the Senate. There are 18 physicians, 5 dentists, 1 veterinarian, and 3 nurses in the current Congress. I often, if I were in person, I'd make people guess, but I won't do you that online. How many lawyers are there in Congress? There are currently 144 members that have law degrees. This is important to note that 22 members of Congress have no educational degree beyond a high school diploma, and 5 only have associate degrees, although I point out that these members are politically very smart. They've risen up through state legislative bodies and they know politics. And so don't discount that. And then also it's important to note that not many people in Congress, only 26, have doctoral degrees in any field. So now I want to talk a little bit about the context that we see that everybody is operating in Washington these days, but I'm going to talk about how it affects science. And that's the tremendously polarized political environment in which we live and why it exists. So there are some political scientists who've done some analysis of crossover voting, the willingness of Democrats to vote with Republicans and vice versa. They've found that the Congress is more polarized now than it was even after the Reconstruction era, immediately following the Civil War. Why is that? Well, one can look at the fact that we have gerrymandered districts such that a lot of political races are run in a primary. And this is a chart that was developed by Nate Silver, who's a political, he's one of those people you see when around the time of elections talking about congressional races and crunches a bunch of numbers. what you see is that there's a tremendous decline in the number of competitive districts between Democrats and Republicans or swing districts at the congressional level. So in 1992, the year Bill Clinton was elected, there were 103 swing districts defined by, as Silber defines it, where the Republican and Democratic candidates, there was, for the presidency, there was less than a 5% margin between what they won by in that district. If there's more than that, then really you could expect that it was a largely Republican or Democratic leaning district, which meant that a member of Congress likely, if they won their primary, they'd win the election. And you see that it was 103, and that was the 1992, the year Bill Clinton was elected president. 2016, the year Donald Trump was elected, we were down to 37 swing districts. And the problem with that is, if you elect ideologues to Congress, I often warn scientists that it's been the people in the middle who we aren't electing because we don't have the swing districts who listen to facts and change their mind based upon evidence. But ideologues on the left or the right come to Congress with their minds already made up. The other thing to note is not just Congress. This polarization is a phenomenon that's occurring amongst the American people, in part because if you lean Republican or you lean Democrat, you can now watch cable news that just pushes you further. You get different views of reality if you watch CNN, or if you are not CNN, let's use MSNBC on the left, and let's use Fox News on the right. And then you also talk to people on social media who maintain your own views. So we've seen an increasingly polarized public. And the interesting thing is that polarization splits largely rural and urban, with those swing districts being suburban. So you see this map from the 2016 presidential election. Those light blue areas are suburbs. And that's where those 37 swing districts that I talk about are located. In fact, David Wasserman, who works for Charlie Cook, who's also one of those political analysts that we see who monitors congressional races, came up with what he calls the Whole Foods versus Cracker Barrel indicator. And it essentially is that congressional districts that had a Whole Foods or Cracker Barrel, and then they analyzed how people voted in those districts starting in 1992, and they found the difference in 92 was only 19% difference. By 2012, the year President Obama was elected, there was a 46% gap. And by the time in 2016, the difference between those was 54%. So, and of course, Cracker Barrels are often located as you travel somewhere on the exit in very rural areas, and Whole Foods are located in much more urban areas. So it really kind of denotes this growing cultural divide. And what worries me a little bit about this, representing the universities I do, is if you look at where the universities I represent are located in the United States and how people voted in those counties and congressional districts, there are 3 of our universities where those congressional districts in which those universities were located voted for Donald Trump. And it means that we have a divided country, and how people speak and think may be different depending on where they live. How's that play out? Well, I think we've seen it in the pandemic, in that you've seen this politicization of mask wearing and the politicization of science in ways that I never could have imagined, and I think are concerning. And so when I'm back in Arlington, Virginia, and I still go into stores, everybody's wearing a mask. I was here in October and November of last year, and I went into Walmart, and about 40% of the people were not wearing any mask at all in the height of the pandemic. And you see that, and you see that this has really been an issue where science has been polarized. One of the challenges too is people don't understand, and I think this is something we talk about, that science changes. And in the beginning, of course, Tony Fauci said, well, we don't think maybe you need to wear a mask. But as we learn more about COVID-19, that was discredited. But people would go back and say, well, Tony Fauci doesn't know what he's talking about. He says, first, you don't need to wear a mask. Now you do need to wear a mask. He can't even figure it out. But science moves. We all know that. but many people don't understand it, and allows the public to be confused by politicians who are taking sometimes and politicizing science in very negative ways. And you see the difference in the views as it relates to mask wearing that we saw back in April and May, according to this Gallup poll. So I just want to conclude here with how can you be effective in this environment as an advocate for science? Well, one is, remember, all politics is local. That's what Tip O'Neill said, and that politicians are going to care about what their constituents care most about. So the people you have the most ability to influence are going to be the representatives that you vote for. But then the other thing is, all politics is not only local, it's personal. So as we talk about what science means and why it matters, you have to think about why it matters to the person you're talking to. And so when we went in and tried to convince a politician who was a car salesman of the importance of science, we would talk about the role that basic science had played in helping improve the modern automobile. When we talk to people on the Armed Services Committee, we talk about how basic science had helped troops in the field. Third thing is, while data is good and scientists love data, sometimes tying data to stories is going to make a much stronger case. And Jim Cooper, who helped create an award I'll talk about here in a second, the Golden Goose Award, often quotes this Indian proverb and about the importance of stories. And he will say the scientific community is not good at telling their own story and telling stories, but anecdotes often are the currency that help drive policy in Washington. And so used to be, there was a member of Congress, Bill Proxmire, he would give an award called the Golden Fleece Award, which would kind of make fun of scientific grants that sounded like they were funding a waste of taxpayer dollars. It wasn't just science, he did it for other things too. But science got overly picked on. And Jim Cooper came to the AAU and the American Association for Advancement, said, we need to fight against this because some of these grants that are being picked on are really important science. We need to explain it better. So we created, at his suggestion, what's been called the Golden Goose Award. I encourage you to look at some of the stories, but it's about funny sounding science that could have been received a Golden Fleece Award that's changed people's lives. Things like, one of the first recipients of the award was Charles Towns. Charles Towns, he invented the maser, which led to the laser, which at the time it was invented was dubbed a solution in search of a problem. Nobody knew what to use it for. In fact, he came and accepted the award at 97 years old and talked about how his own department chair had taken him to task for wasting the department's money. We know more recently things like mRNA, which led to the vaccine, critical, to the vaccine, wouldn't have happened were it not for a researcher whose research on this topic was really questioned as whether it had value in the early days. Many other things have won the Golden Goose Award. So I just want to conclude with the last thing to remember, that the language you use really matters. And on this one, I just want to say, Alan Alda, who's an actor, some of you may be familiar with him, started the Alda Center for Scientific Communications at Stony Brook. He talks about overcoming the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is not remembering what it's like not to know what you know. And that's one of the biggest challenges scientists have, is they can't talk to somebody who doesn't know what they know. And so they often talk over their head, and that is not helpful. In fact, Alda teaches scientists at their center at Stony Brook how to do improv, to try and better connect to the audience and understand what they're interested in hearing versus what you might think they would want to know. It's also, you need to understand what the public opinion is. And remember that we don't just have one public. I just talked about the differences between rural areas and how they view the world and more urban areas. So at AAU, we've actually started, and we've hired a professional pollster who we are out in the field testing information about what language to use to deliver effective messages about science every week. An example is that, for example, we talk about basic research. I used it in the speech. They've done some focus groups on basic research Do you know what people say? Why are we funding basic research? We should be funding tough, hard research. So we have to be careful to remember not everybody knows what we know, and you need to know how people view these things and the words we use. That will help us formulate an effective message, which will be more important and help us to advance our interest in seeing science taken into account in policymaking. The other thing I say is it's really important not to always talk first, but to listen and to build a common ground. One of the questions I know is, and I often get is, how do you connect to policymakers who don't believe and might be, against climate change? Well, the first thing you do is you find out where you do agree or where you have things in common. Maybe you grew up in the same town. Maybe you have, relatives who had the same disease. You need to ask questions, and that can help you form a bond that will help you then talk about tougher issues. So I'm the last slide here, and then I'm going to open up for questions. Why is effective advocacy for science in this environment really important? Well, first, I know it seems sometimes like there's not a lot of funding for science, but if you really look at the charts that AAAS puts out, funding for science has been steadily increasing. NIH has gotten boosts on the order of $2 to $3 billion the last couple of years. Even the NSF, it's not been quite as great, but it's gotten increases and hasn't been cut the way other domestic programs have. So thank members. But we need to remember the budgets are tight. It's going to be hard to make the case, but there are some opportunities like the legislation I mentioned that's going through that would significantly authorize more money for the National Science Foundation. So we need people to advocate for that and then advocate for the appropriations money to come after that money is authorized. There's also going to be questions like the ones that Bill Proxmire raised. Are the funds for science really being utilized effectively? And because many members are not familiar with science, they may think they aren't. And then many of you are graduate students. So I just want to say the other thing you need to do, and you can do better than any faculty member or senior researcher, is talk about how in the US, money that goes to fund research also funds students and education. And many members who are paying back their law school loans don't understand that. They were never funded off a research grant, and they don't know how valuable that has been to make our system of scientific support for scientific research unique in the world. The other thing they don't understand is how important international talent has been to not only our universities, but we know statistics like more immigrants start companies than native-born Americans in high-tech fields. So it's important for people to convey the importance that we continue to attract and retain the best talent from around the world here in the United States. I mentioned regulations and clients. I spend a lot of time working on that. A lot of folks think that their job is done once the law is passed. If they get it passed, they don't need to do anything else. But oftentimes science, the policy that affects science is most affected by the regulations that come and are drafted after the law, for which there are always opportunities to provide public comment and provide input. The last thing, last 2 points here. We need people to engage because the bottom line is we want policy to be based on science as opposed to alternative facts in an era where we have more of those facts seem to be creeping in that aren't based on science. And the last thing is, let's face it, we wouldn't have been out of this pandemic had we not spent years of fundamental research on mRNA and things like that. So when we really needed industry to step up, they were able within a year then develop a vaccine, but it wouldn't have happened had there not been years of foundational basic research done to support it. So with that, the last thing is there are resources that you can use. I know that was a question. I want to point out, first of all, I tweet a lot about science policy, so you can follow me on Twitter. AAU Universities talks and provides on their Twitter account a lot of information. If you're interested in science policy careers, make sure to follow on Twitter the SciPol Jobs hashtag, which is the creation of ESEP, Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy, which I'm co-chair of. and helped to found. Additionally, science policy resources are on the ESEP webpage, which you can see there. And we also are tweeting about resources that are out there. And I also encourage you, there's additional resources, including information about internships and fellowships on the book webpage that we've created. So with that, I have talked far too long, and I'm going to open it up for questions from Adriana.
Great, thank you, Toby. Lots of really good points, and I've been following the questions that we've gotten, so I'm going to try to group them together around certain themes that have come up. So several have been around the Bush-Kilgore debate and the funding versus funding based on merit versus geography. And can you talk a little bit about that, whether that was more, which model was more supported in that time, and how does that look like today?
Yeah, I think as you said, it was Bush won the debate, and it was merit-based competition, and it was the notion that scientists and groups of scientists would judge scientific proposals submitted by scientists. There'd be a review process, and then the funding would go to the best scientists in the country. The challenge with that is that you saw certain states benefit from that, and certain states kind of lost out. And now there's an interest in the current legislation I mentioned in the Senate to reorient that, and that's what EPSCoR was about when it was created. I think I forget exactly when EPSCoR was created. It's been around at least about 20 years or more, but they want to expand that program because there's a feeling that every state should benefit from science. We often argue that there are great economic benefits, so shouldn't you spread that all around? That was Kilgore's view. But it's not clear. You have to find that right balance. I'd also argue that there are institutions that we need to be doing and training students in research that have been left behind. And the big debate right now is what about historically Black colleges and universities? And how do we build capacity there? Because if we're going to train and we want a more diverse scientific workforce, we have to get individuals at those universities to have research experiences just like they do at the ones I represent, or other minority serving institutions. So it's finding the right balance. And like I say, there's no right answers here. You have members of Congress who have different opinions, largely depending on which state they come from and how well they're doing. And so maybe the notion of 20% of the new funding for NSF going to EPSCoR states, it's a huge change. There's in fact a recent Science article on this, and I'd encourage people to look at it about the push for this. And the difference between kind of the House and the Senate views. But I do think some effort to increase the capacity of some of those other institutions is worthwhile. It's just finding what's the right level. And that's where the debate on policy is going to happen.
Yes, definitely agree with that. So you talked a lot about polarization and how science and politics go together. And so we discussed this sort of in the pre-call as well, but what does it mean to follow the science in a polarized world today, and making sure that it's not aligned with a party, that it remains separate from politics? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think one of the things is, and one of the challenges for the general public is they don't understand how science works, and that science is not static. Science changes, especially when I'm just going to use the pandemic as an example. We were learning all along the way, first because people didn't know that it was airborne virus originally, right? That's why you had Tony Fauci saying, you don't need to wear a mask. It's probably not that helpful. And then as we studied it and they understood more, his opinion changed. Yet politicians, for political reasons, then didn't change and tried to use that for their own political gains and ends, which wasn't helpful. So I think the scientific community needs to work on trying to explain, and we need to think about how we educate people just about the process of science and the fact that it is not static, it moves. It's a very good article I'd recommend that has a title similar to the one you raised, is exactly that. In a polarized world, what does it mean to follow the science? It discusses some of these debates around students going to classes during the pandemic. We have these same things about the good news. I will say one thing in a polarized world it's kind of you're going to think that this is not necessarily good news, but it is positive in that nobody wants to say they're against science. Everybody wants to say they support science. But what you find is that on climate change, for instance, that based upon your ideology, you judge as scientists not by whether their science is really the consensus, but whether their science aligns with the ideological views you already maintain. That's a bit scary, and it's something we have to work on. And I think something where historically, and I would have thought that we wouldn't get there in medicine and with the pandemic, but because I think of the way that politicians took it, and we live in such a polarized era where it doesn't seem you can find much common ground in anything. And I just warn that we have to be really careful, and scientists and engineers need to be really careful, because I don't know if I stressed it enough, but science has no political party. Science is the facts. It's the evidence. It doesn't belong to Republicans. It doesn't belong to Democrats. And I warn people that if we start thinking that science is in one camp or the other, we've got a big problem. In fact, you look historically, science, the doubling of the NIH funding, for example, supported by 2 Republicans. Bill Clinton would lowball funding for NIH during the time when, and we watched John Porter and Alan Specter, who chair the Appropriations Committee, increase it. And there's been continued strong conservative support for NIH funding. So we just have to be careful, because I think, yes, there are some areas where it's really polarized. There are other areas of science where it's still pretty bipartisan in terms of support.
Yeah, so maybe related to that, how do we communicate this to the public? So what do you think is a challenge in communicating and advocating for science to the general public, as you've shown some examples and some ways that work better for the public to be interested in science and the arguments that we're making, but are there ways that you think we can overcome this, some of these issues that the public may have?
I'm going to go right back to what I said at one of the last points I made: listen instead of talk. Too often scientists talk and don't listen. And so on climate change, they would talk about, isn't it unfortunate that we're losing the polar bears in the Arctic? Well, if you're a farmer in Iowa who's worried about are they going to, are they going to make money on this year's crop? They're not really worried too much about the polar bears, even though it's an important issue, let's face it. But how do you connect with them? So the first thing you need to do is listen to what they care about, and then relate that to how the problem might affect them personally. It gets back to, again, all politics is personal, all politics is local, and it all roots down to where a person lives and what they care about and how scientists talk to them. It's one of the reasons I worry that we don't have many of our universities in districts that are more rural. And so I think we have to listen first and then figure out how science can help people where they're at. And oftentimes we find with the polling we do, the medical advances in the hospitals, we're well recognized for that. We have to do a better job of talking about some of the advantages and how the physical sciences help people, how social sciences help people. So I think it's really important that and this gets again to the language you use matters, and thinking about how do you talk to somebody who doesn't understand what you know in a way that they will value and appreciate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So there are also some questions about universities, and also this came up before and through the forum that a lot of trainees want to advocate for changes in higher education, and how universities have changed as a result of allowing them to retain intellectual property. That's one of the questions. But do you have, obviously from your perspective working with institutions, how do you think trainees can advocate for improving institutions?
Well, it depends on the topic. I mean, one is to certainly, there's two things to remember. There's advocating through a political route and going to Congress or going to state legislators and advocating that the way. There's also advocating for internal reform. And I don't underestimate the importance that graduate students can play to try and encourage senior leadership to change, especially in how we train graduate students, I think, and making sure that we're training them broadly enough for a wide range of careers and things like that. And I think there's more focus on that. As it relates to those other issues, I think it's important to, to engage with policymakers and be involved. And I'd also say another way to get involved is through scientific societies. They have a lot to offer. I think people don't remember that they sponsor fly-in days. And you can do that. And it's better to do it when you're younger and get involved, because they are desperate for young people to come and advocate. And I would also argue that graduate students, having worked with many of them, they don't realize the power that they have when they go and talk to members of Congress. I often say that I love to take undergraduate and graduate students in, because unlike the faculty member that I take that had a large grants and ran a large lab and had lots of people employed, these are the future. They represent the future scientists, and the policies we're creating today will affect the science they're able to do in the future. And so hearing from them, and I can tell stories about when I worked for MIT lobbying for magnetic fusion, and I try to get to Teddy Kennedy's legislative person who did education and science. They wouldn't return my calls. When did they return? Well, they didn't return my call. When did I hear from them? When they got a letter from the graduate students who were worried about the future of the fusion lab. Why? Because Ted Kennedy cared about education, cared about students. And I was asked, do you know who led this letter? Because the senator has asked me to reach out to this group. So don't underestimate the importance that you can have and the impact you can have, because I think that's, it's better to get involved earlier and find out ways to do that.
Yes, thank you. Definitely agree. So maybe to wrap that up, how can trainees learn about sort of what the most relevant policy issues are that they should follow? Do you have resources to recommend?
Yeah, so certainly there are on the ESEP webpage, there's a resources page, and I look there, and there's some good things that are, if you want to follow science policy, I'll give you a few tips. And this is far from comprehensive. Follow things like Science Insider. That's the Science Magazine's daily kind of blog that they post of stories about policy issues in Washington. Sign up for the American Institute of Physics AIP FYI posts, and they send out emails with a lot of really timely information. Read Issues in Science and Technology, which is a publication that's co-produced by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine with the Arizona State University. That has a lot of topics that are there. It's not so like this is what's happening today in Washington as those first two resources, but has a lot of really good pieces on current science and technology policy issues. That's just a start. There's a number of others. The other thing, like I said, get involved in AAAS, because they actually have a policy update that you can get. Get involved in your scientific society and make sure they know you're interested in policy. Even talk to your government relations representative, and many, I'm sure that's for the university. People like Adriana, who works for the University System of California and does federal relations, and ask for their advice. I'd also say, though, again, the societies, AAAS, get involved in those groups, and remember, they are interested in having students involved.
Great. So as a last question, since to wrap up this sort of in a historical sense, since we're in a pandemic and you sort of touched upon this, what do you see as the science policy landscape now and post-pandemic in terms of challenges and opportunities?
Well, I think the challenges, and I tried to explain that the worry I have is that as we get more polarized and we don't have people looking at evidence, that's going to be an ongoing challenge. And it also means it's a challenge that I think goes right down to even how we teach science early on. And frankly, a challenge for our universities, because we have in universities, it's been okay to kind of say, for faculty, to say, look to your right, look to your left. My responsibility is only to train people like myself. And so I don't need to worry about the rest of you. If you fail, you'll go to the social science courses or humanities and you'll do fine, and that's great. But I only need to touch the best and brightest. That has been so damaging. And when I go in and I meet with the chairman of the House Science Committee, which I've done, and they tell me the story of how they were really interested in science. And then they got into their undergraduate career and they just realized it wasn't for them. And a lot of times it was not because it wasn't for them. It was because they had a poor faculty member who taught and lectured and didn't really teach them as well as they could have. And we know based upon, we talk about evidence-based policy, we know based upon evidence how to teach better. And we need to teach our faculty. So I think, and why do I say that? Because it worries me when people don't know that science isn't static. They don't know how to differentiate between the facts and just things that are on the internet. And they don't do the work that any good scientist would do to know if it's actually true or not. And so I think we worry too much about teaching some of the I don't know, the chemistry or physics, but we don't think about, are we teaching people just how to think like a scientist? And that's what we need to think about starting at the earliest levels. And it's one of the challenges and a cultural divide that I think we need to try and address, and scientists need to take it on. That also means they need to understand the other culture a lot more than they do and not just assume. And that's where people like Adriana, like you, like what I've done through my whole career can kind of help bridge that gap. I talk about the cross-cultural divide, and I often say, this is what federal relations people do. They help people navigate. And just as if you went to another country, you could get a map and you kind of stumble around, but you don't speak the language. It's much better, and you have a much better experience if you get a tour guide. So we need more people also. And this is a job for scientists. Some are good at this. That's where alternative careers come in that aren't just, you don't have to be a good scientist. You don't just have to work at the bench. You can be a member of Congress. You can be a high school science teacher. You can be a government relations person. Those are all valid ways to go. We just need to convince our faculty that that's important. And I know that's a challenge, but we need to talk about it. And they need to understand that it hurts them if they kind of just think they can hang out in their labs all the time and don't have to talk to other people, including policymakers, to explain why they're doing what they're doing and why it's important to not just them, but to the whole of society. We certainly saw that with the pandemic, and I think we need to make that case for other areas of why science is valuable to everybody and the entire society. So